Welcome. I'd really appreciate if you could drop a comment with your thoughts and reactions as you listen. Your feedback helps me craft better stories for you. The ruins of the city stretched as far as the eye could see, crumbling structures silhouetted against a blood-red sky. Lila picked her way carefully through the debris, Ethan close behind. They had been on the run for days, scavenging what meager supplies they could find amid the chaos. Now, more than ever, they needed shelter, and fast. The telltale moans in the distance signaled an approaching horde. Lila spotted a nondescript metal door set into a mound of rubble and hurried toward it, Ethan on her heels. She shoved at the heavy portal with all her might. It creaked open reluctantly to reveal a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness. "In here," she hissed, gesturing frantically. Ethan didn't need telling twice. He slipped through and helped pull the door shut behind them, sealing out the fading daylight. Pitch blackness enveloped them. Lila fumbled for her flashlight, clicking it on with relief. An ominous name for an ominous place. But it was shelter, and that's what mattered now. They descended the crumbling steps carefully, senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving after the chaos above. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness as they made their way down a long, featureless corridor. Dust coated every surface. This place had been abandoned for a long time. Lila swept her light across peeling walls, taking in faded warnings and diagrams that hinted at some sinister purpose this complex once served. Experiments of some kind. If the medical terminology was any indication, a chill ran down her spine. What had happened here? A faint scuttling sound made her jump. He nodded, face grim in the half-light. "We're not alone down here." They pressed on, senses straining for any sign of the stalking presence they both felt watching from the shadows. Storage rooms held only dust and echoes. Then Lila's light fell upon a set of deep gouges scored into the wall, as if something large had been dragged. Fresh dread coiled in her gut. Just then, a low moan reverberated down the corridor, raising the hairs on her neck. She swung around wildly, but still saw only darkness. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need to get out of here," Ethan said, voice tight. But when they retraced their steps, their worst fear was realized. The heavy door stood sealed shut, trapping them in this subterranean maze. As unearthly howls rose in the distance, a terrible certainty took hold. Whatever lurked in the depths of this abyss had now marked them as its prey. The flashlight beam flickered and died, plunging Lila and Ethan into absolute darkness. Lila's heart raced as she shook the lifeless torch, to no avail. "The batteries must be dead," she whispered. A rustling sound came from the corridor ahead. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her close. "It's coming," he breathed, barely audible. They stood frozen, senses straining against the blackness. Slow, methodical footsteps approached, accompanied by a strange, wet dragging. Lila pictured soulless eyes peering through the dark, homing in on their prey. The noises stopped, mere feet away it seemed. Heavy breathing filled the air. Then, as suddenly as it began, the presence retreated back down the corridor. Lila let out a shuddering breath, legs trembling with relief and fear. "We can't stay here," Ethan murmured. Feeling along the wall, they inched forward cautiously. The flashlight's demise left them virtually blind in this lightless maze. After what seemed like hours, Lila's fingers brushed against a doorframe. She pushed inside eagerly, hoping for supplies or an escape route. Instead, her foot kicked something soft. A musty odor assaulted her nostrils. Switching on a lighter revealed desiccated human remains strewn about the small room. Lila stifled a scream, clamping a hand over her mouth. Ethan swept the flickering flame across journals and files scattered near the skeletons. "Looks like some kind of staff quarters. Maybe we'll find clues." He handed a weathered notebook to Lila, who began reading entries by the light of the makeshift torch. Day 12 of trials. Subject 4 began showing signs of mutation after injection with Serum X. Violent outbursts and rapid physical changes observed. Had to terminate early for safety. Serum is making progress, but results too unpredictable to continue. Lila's blood ran cold. What kind of experiments took place here? She read on, growing more disturbed. Day 42. Containment breach on level 3. Subjects 12 and 15 overpowered guards and escaped labs. Security teams dispatched but no trace found. Entire staff on lockdown until further notice. A scuttling sound made her jump. "Ethan, did you hear that?" But he was engrossed in another journal. Face ashen. "Lila, look at this." He handed her a tattered photo. It showed a group of scientists posing outside the bunker entrance, smiling casually. But one figure was circled, a hulking, misshapen thing lurking in the background. A note scrawled below read, Subject 12. A bone-chilling howl rose in the distance, shaking dust from the ceiling. "We need to move. Now," Lila cried. But as they fled the gruesome quarters, deeper mysteries beckoned them into the abyss. The tunnels seemed to stretch on endlessly before them, as Lila and Ethan hurried through the darkness. Their meager supplies were almost depleted. Worse still, the howls and dragging footsteps of their pursuer had grown steadily louder over the past hours. Lila's heart leapt into her throat as the noises suddenly ceased. An unnatural stillness fell over the maze. She grabbed Ethan's arm, halting. "Do you think it's gone?" she whispered. As if in response, a low rumble echoed down the corridor behind them. Heavy footfalls resumed, quickening in pace. "It knows we're weak," Ethan muttered, breaking into a run. They careened blindly through the twisting tunnels. A faint glow up ahead raised Lila's hopes. Was it the surface? But as they stumbled into an open chamber, her spirits crashed. Glowing fungus dotted the cavernous room, illuminating piles of bones and rusted equipment. A dead end. They spun, breath-catching at a looming shadow at the chamber entrance. Eyes like molten gold peered from a misshapen, hairless skull. Muscles rippled beneath glistening flesh as the creature blocked their only escape. Subject 12. Lila realized with dread. It cocked its head, regarding them curiously. Then its lipless mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of serrated teeth. A guttural roar shook dust from the ceiling as it charged. Ethan shoved Lila aside just as massive claws slashed where she'd stood. She rolled to her feet, grabbing a length of pipe from the debris. When the beast turned on Ethan, she swung with all her might. Metal connected with flesh with a sickening crunch. It howled in rage and pain, whirling on her. Lila scrambled back, but it was too fast, seizing her in a crushing grip. She gasped, ribs creaking as it lifted her struggling form. Yellow eyes bored into her own, as if deciding whether to snap her in two. Then Ethan was there, jamming the pipe into its spine. It shrieked, flinging Lila aside. She hit the wall hard, vision swimming. Through a haze, she saw Ethan grappling with the monster, both tumbling out of view. Her name echoed distantly. Somehow, Lila dragged herself up. She had to help Ethan. Stumbling into a side passage, a glow up ahead spurred her on. Rounding a bend, her heart leapt. Dim emergency lights illuminated an exit sign over a heavy steel door. She threw her weight against the lever, crying out in relief as it creaked open. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain. Lila tumbled outside, collapsing onto wet pavement. The city ruins loomed above, bathed in moonlight. A bestial roar shook her from her daze. "Ethan!" She scrambled back to the entrance just as he burst through, Subject 12, snapping at his heels. With a final shove, the door slammed shut on its grasping claws. Panting, Ethan pulled her into his arms. They had escaped the abyss, but what other terrors still lurked in the ruins above? The sun beat down mercilessly as the small boat drifted aimlessly across the rolling waves. Sofia shielded her eyes, scanning the empty horizon for any sign of land or another vessel. But there was nothing as far as the eye could see, just the vast blue expanse of the unforgiving sea. "Anything?" asked Alex hoarsely from beneath the meager shelter of a tattered sail. His face was drawn and pale from days without proper food or water. Sofia shook her head, her throat parched. Their supplies had run out the previous day, and they were both weak from hunger and exposure. How long could they last like this, adrift at the mercy of the currents, she wondered. Not long, she feared. It had been over a month since the outbreak began in their coastal town. At first, it was just rumors of people behaving strangely, becoming violent without warning. Then the attack started, and the true horror of what was happening became clear. The infected were not just sick. They were the living dead, driven only by a savage hunger for human flesh. Sofia and Alex had survived by hiding in his family's boathouse, scavenging what supplies they could from the abandoned streets. But as the infected population grew, it became too dangerous to venture out. They decided their only chance was to flee by sea and make for the nearest reported safe haven across the water. But now, after weeks adrift with no sign of land, even that hope seemed lost. "There!" Alex suddenly cried out, pointing a shaking finger to the north. Sofia followed his gaze and gasped. Emerging from the haze on the horizon was the unmistakable silhouette of a massive ship. It was hard to judge the distance, but even from afar, she could tell it was enormous, dwarfing their tiny boat. "Do you think it's still crewed?" Alex asked, a glimmer of desperate hope in his eyes. Sofia shook her head doubtfully. "It's been drifting. Look how it's listing to one side. I think she's abandoned. But even a derelict ship could mean shelter and perhaps supplies," she realized. Their chances of survival were slimming by the hour. "We have to check it out." It took the remainder of the day for the gentle currents to carry them closer to the hulking shape, looming before them. As dusk fell, they were near enough to make out details in the fading light. The ship was a massive cargo vessel, rust streaking its steel hull. Paint was peeling to reveal its name, Leviathan. But it was the sight of the upper decks that sent a chill through Sofia. Railings were bent and broken. Cargo cranes lay in twisted heaps. Dark stains that could only be blood were splattered across the deck. A sense of violent struggle was etched into every surface. "What do you think happened here?" Alex whispered, as if afraid to disturb whatever malevolent presence might still linger aboard. Sofia had no answer, but a feeling of nameless dread was coiling in her gut. As they drifted ever closer, not a sound or sight of life stirred on the ghostly ship. Only an eerie stillness and silence greeted them in the gathering gloom. Whatever fate had befallen the Leviathan's crew, she feared it may have left something worse in its wake. Under cover of darkness, they maneuvered their boat alongside the freighter and climbed aboard with shaking limbs. Sofia's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the metal decking. She paused, straining her ears for any sign they were not alone. But there was nothing, just the creaking of the great vessel and the lapping of waves against its hull. They split up to search for supplies, Alex taking the bridge while Sofia headed below decks. Her flashlight cut feeble swaths through the darkness as she picked her way down narrow stairwells. The lower levels seemed intact, but utterly deserted. Cabins stood empty. Cargo holds were bare, but she sensed a lingering unease, as if unseen eyes watched her passage through the ship. Reaching the deepest level, Sofia paused at a heavy steel door. Muffled thuds and scraping sounds were drifting up from somewhere behind it, raising the hairs on her neck. She backed away slowly, heart pounding, then turned and fled back the way she had come as fast as her legs could carry her. Whatever was stirring in the depths of the Leviathan, she prayed never to encounter it, face to face in the darkness. The night passed slowly aboard the ghostly Leviathan. Sofia and Alex took turns keeping watch, but no further sounds disturbed the stillness. As dawn light filtered down through the upper decks, they met to share a meager ration of water and plan their next move. "We should explore the bridge and crew quarters today to see if any logs or maps were left behind," said Sofia. With luck, they could give clues to where supplies might be stored or how to operate the ship. Alex nodded hesitantly. "Just be careful. I don't like the feeling this place gives me." They split up once more, searching methodically through the maze of corridors. Sofia found the bridge intact, but covered in a thin film of dust. Charts and manuals lay scattered across consoles, some pages fluttering slightly as if recently disturbed. Deeper inside the ship, Alex pried open doors to crew quarters with increasing unease. Bunks sat undisturbed, but the air felt heavy as if some nameless presence lingered in each room. On the next level down, a dark stain in the corridor sent his heart racing. Hastily backing away, he bumped into something solid in the shadows. Whirling with a gasp, Alex found himself face to face with a figure. But it was only his own pale reflection in a glass panel. He realized with a shaky laugh. Yet as he turned to leave, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. A shuffling sound, like dragging footsteps, echoed up from somewhere below. Alex fled back to the upper decks, breathing hard. "Sofia, I think we shouldn't linger here. This place feels cursed." She nodded slowly. "I found charts, but no log. Let's gather what supplies we can carry and get back to the boat by nightfall." They met heavy silence within the ship as they scoured its depths. Only the faintest echoes of their own movements broke the stillness. By late afternoon, their packs were filled with canned goods and bottles of water from a storage hold. Yet an unseen menace seemed to stalk their footsteps as they hurried back to the upper levels. Darkness was falling as they climbed topside, the sky bruised with twilight. Sofia paused at the rail, gazing out at the gathering gloom. "Look, on the horizon." A shape was emerging from the haze, growing larger by the minute. Alex grabbed a pair of binoculars and peered through them with a gasp. "It's another ship, and it's heading this way fast." Sofia scanned the waters with rising dread. Their small boat was nowhere in sight. "Do you think anyone aboard saw our lights last night? They must have come looking." "Maybe, but something doesn't feel right." Alex handed her the binoculars with a shaking hand. Through the lenses, Sofia could just make out figures moving jerkily along the deck of the approaching vessel. Even at a distance, their shambling gaits looked unnatural, halted. A sense of horror dawned as she lowered the glasses slowly. "It's them, the infected." The infected ship was closing fast, its lights now visible on the darkening horizon. Sofia and Alex fled below decks, knowing they were trapped aboard the Leviathan with no means of escape. "We need to barricade ourselves and wait until dawn," said Sofia grimly. "With luck, they'll lose our trail in the dark." They hurried through the maze of corridors, piling furniture and cargo nets behind them. Finally, reaching the deepest level, they wedged the heavy steel door shut and slumped exhausted against the wall. Only a thin barrier now separated them from whatever nightmares lurked in the ship's depths. Sofia strained her ears, but heard nothing beyond the door, just their own ragged breathing in the suffocating silence. As night fell, a deep rumbling shudder ran through the Leviathan's steel bones. Alex and Sofia grabbed each other in alarm, exchanging a fearful look in the dim glow of their flashlight. "What was that?" Alex whispered. Before Sofia could answer, a heavy thud sounded directly outside the door, making them jump. Then another, and another. A slow, relentless pounding that set their hearts racing. The infected had found their way aboard. Gripping their meager weapons, a crowbar and flare gun, they backed away from the door. In the darkness beyond, They could hear it now. A multitude of dragging footsteps and guttural moans as the horde closed in. A screech of tearing metal rent the air. With a final crash, the door caved inward amid a shower of sparks. Shambling silhouettes lurched through the gap, jaws working hungrily. Sofia fired the flare gun with a prayer, illuminating a nightmare. Dozens of infected crew members blocked the corridor, flesh hanging from their bones. She dragged Alex away as they surged forward with outstretched hands. They fled through the bowels of the ship, the horde's moans echoing behind them. Emerging on an upper level, Sofia spotted their pursuers shambling up the stairwell and slammed the heavy hatch shut. "This way," she cried, pulling Alex along the corridor. A crashing boom shook the deck. The infected had broken through the lower hatch. They burst onto the cargo deck, panting, but their hopes were shattered. More infected were swarming across from the neighboring ship. Sofia and Alex backed against the rail, surrounded on all sides by the advancing dead. In that moment, Sofia knew this was how she would die. But she would not go down without a fight. "When I say run, jump overboard," she shouted to Alex above the moans. She fired her last flare into the oncoming swarm. As they recoiled, she screamed now and shoved Alex over the rail. She hurled her empty gun into the horde and followed him into the inky sea below. Breaking the surface, she gasped for air amid the churning waves. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of Alex treading water and crying her name. She struck out towards him through the darkness, the Leviathan's decks above echoing with an unholy chorus as the infected claimed their floating tomb. Exhausted and numb with shock, Sofia and Alex clung to each other as the currents carried them away into the black night. They had escaped the grasp of the undead Leviathan, but whether they would survive the open ocean until dawn was another story. All they could do was hope that fate, or whatever higher power remained, would show them mercy. The fire crackled weakly, struggling to push back the chill that had seeped into the old log cabin. Nora sat huddled close, wrapped in every scrap of cloth she could find. Across from her, Luke fed another piece of splintered furniture into the flames, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "How much longer do you think the wood will last?" Nora asked through chattering teeth. Luke shook his head. "A day. Maybe 2. They both glanced apprehensively at the boarded windows. For weeks, the howling wind had been their only companion as roaming dead shuffled endlessly through the forest beyond. The zombies had followed them even this high into the remote mountains, cut off from any hope of rescue or resupply. A sharp crackle startled them both. Luke pulled a battered radio from his pack and twisted the dial, searching for any sign that humanity still survived somewhere out there in the wintry darkness. Static was all that answered. He was about to give up when a voice suddenly broke through, a man speaking in calm, measured tones. "This is Dr. Emil Markov with an important message. The cataclysm is coming, and it will cleanse the world." Nora and Luke exchanged a look of surprise and confusion. What was this cataclysm? They listened intently as the man continued. "For too long, mankind has corrupted nature and destroyed itself. But the forces that shape this planet will not be denied. The cataclysm will reset the balance and determine who is worthy to inherit what remains. Seek the source of this message if you hope to survive." The transmission cut out, replaced once more by empty static. Luke adjusted the dial frantically, but could find no other station. An eerie silence fell over the cabin as they pondered the cryptic words. "Do you think it could be real?" Nora asked hesitantly. "Some kind of event that might stop this." She gestured hopelessly around at their deteriorating shelter. Luke frowned, running a hand through his shaggy hair. As a scientist, he didn't put much stock in vague prophecies, but they were out of alternatives. "It's the only lead we've got, and I'd rather die trying to find answers than waiting here to starve or freeze." Nora nodded slowly. stealing her nerves. After so many nights, fearing the dead might break in, the prospect of venturing into the infected wilds was terrifying. But sitting idle was its own kind of death. Then, at first light, we go. They spent the remaining hours of darkness feeding the fire and preparing their meager supplies for the journey. When pale dawn finally lightened the sky, they shouldered their packs and took a last, long look around the shelter that had been their prison for so long. Then, with a shared breath to steady their nerves, Nora unbarred the door and they stepped out into the snowy forest. The trees closed in thickly on either side of the narrow trail, muffling their footsteps. Luke took the lead with a hatchet raised, scanning for any signs of the dead. An eerie silence hung in the air. No birds sang, no small animals rustled. It was as if this part of the forest had died along with the rest of the world. Nora followed close behind, jumping at every snapped twig. Her eyes darted back and forth, dreading a glimpse of rotting flesh emerging from the dense undergrowth. After nearly an hour of tense hiking, she began to relax her guard. Perhaps they had left the worst of the infestation behind. She was just beginning to allow herself hope when Luke froze. Nora stumbled to a halt and followed his gaze upward. High in the branches overhead, a pair of eyes stared down at them. But they were not the milky white orbs of a zombie. These eyes were dark, intelligent, and human. As quickly as they had appeared, the eyes blinked and were gone. Nora let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Did you see that?" Luke nodded slowly, brow furrowed. "I thought I was imagining things at first. But those eyes, they looked alive." An uneasy silence fell over them as they resumed their trek, senses on high alert once more. Had there been other survivors all this time, hiding in these very woods? Or was this forest hiding more sinister presences? The trees seemed to watch them as they walked, as if taking note of the intruders in their domain. Nora found her eyes drawn to twisted branches, forming vague shapes, tricked by the play of light and shadow. By midday, when they stopped to eat a meager meal of dried meat and berries, unease had settled heavily in her stomach. She tried to shake off her growing sense of disquiet as they continued on, but it only worsened with each passing hour. The trees had taken on a nightmarish quality, warping at the edges of her vision like things better left unseen. By the time dusk fell, Nora was ready to beg Luke to turn back, to flee from this place that no longer felt like a mere forest. But as darkness closed in, they had no choice but to make camp for the night. Luke gathered deadwood while Nora cleared a space and started a fire with hands that trembled only a little. As the flames crackled to life, she huddled close, watching the dancing shadows for any sign of the eyes from earlier, or worse, things that lurked in the growing gloom. The forest had become a place of fear, but they had come this far seeking answers, and would brave whatever terrors the night held to find them. The fire had long gone out, its ashes cold and gray. Nora stirred fitfully on the hard ground, trapped in the grip of uneasy dreams. Shadows shifted at the edge of the small clearing where she and Luke had made their camp, coalescing into vague shapes that seemed to watch her sleep. She awoke with a gasp, heart pounding. Pale dawn light filtered down through the bare treetops, doing little to banish the shadows. Luke still slept nearby, curled in on himself for warmth. Nora listened intently, but heard nothing to explain what had pulled her from her dreams. Shaking off the last clinging tendrils of fear, she rose and began packing their meager supplies. The firewood was damp and refused to light, so they ate a cold, sparse breakfast of the remaining dried meat and berries. As they shouldered their packs and set off once more into the forest, an air of unease hung over them. The trees seemed to have crept closer during the night, crowding in on the narrow trail. Nora found herself walking as close to Luke as she dared, drawing comfort from the solid presence at her side. But even he appeared more on edge, starting at small noises and constantly scanning their surroundings. By midday, the forest had worked its disquieting magic on both of them. Nora began to question if she was truly seeing the trees shift and change, or if it was just a product of her frayed nerves. When Luke suddenly grabbed her arm, she nearly jumped out of her skin. He pointed wordlessly to the trail ahead. Nora stared, uncomprehending, as it split and forked where before it had run straight. They retraced their steps, but found no other branches, as if the path itself had changed around them. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Nora's spine. This was no trick of the light or tired mind. Something was very wrong with this forest. She turned to Luke, hoping for reassurance, but saw only a deepening frown. Silently, they chose a fork and continued on. That night, their camp was grim and tense. Neither spoke as they ate, too unsettled to do more than huddle close to the fire and scan the encroaching dark. When at last Nora curled up to sleep, she found no rest. Shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, coalescing into vague shapes that seemed almost human. She must have dozed off at some point from sheer exhaustion, because when next she opened her eyes, daylight was filtering down through the bare treetops once more. But something was not right. Nora sat up with a gasp, staring around in disbelief. The campsite was overgrown with waist-high weeds and saplings. Their packs and supplies had rotted or been claimed by small animals. But most unbelievable of all was Luke. His beard was long and matted, his clothes hanging in tatters. He stared back at her with wild eyes. "No," Nora whispered, shaking her head in denial. But it was. Somehow, impossibly, years had passed in the single night they had slept. The forest had worked its insidious magic, stealing away their lives in the blink of an eye. Panic rose like bile in Nora's throat. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling over the uneven ground as the full horror of their situation crashed down. Luke grabbed her arms, his grip painfully tight. "We need to get out of here," he growled, voice ragged with fear and madness. "Now." They abandoned what little remained of their camp without a backward glance. Nora followed blindly as Luke hacked through the overgrown undergrowth, no longer caring about stealth or caution. All that mattered was escaping this twisted place that had laid such a trap. The forest fought them at every turn, branches clawing and vines tripping. More than once, Nora was sure she glimpsed humanoid shapes darting among the trees, gone as soon as she turned to look. By midday, she was beyond exhausted. But stopping was not an option, not with the zombies that had begun to emerge from the woods, drawn by their crashing passage. Their numbers grew with every hour, an ever-tightening noose of rotting flesh. Nora and Luke pushed on long after dark, stumbling blindly through moonlit shadows. When at last they collapsed in a small clearing, it was only to snatch a few hours of fitful rest before rising to flee once more at dawn's first light. How long could they keep running like this? Nora no longer knew or cared. All that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other, keeping the dead at bay for just a little while longer. Something told her this forest would claim them in the end if they did not find a way out, or find answers. Soon. Nora lost track of time as they fled through the haunted forest. Days and nights blurred into an endless cycle of running, hiding, and scrambling away from the ever-tightening ring of zombies. Her body moved on sheer instinct and adrenaline, pushed to the breaking point. Luke fared little better, his eyes wild and movements jerky. He muttered constantly to himself even when the dead were not near, as if conversing with unseen presences. Nora knew that if they did not find a way out soon, his tenuous grip on sanity would slip away entirely. She was just contemplating whether a swift death might be preferable to this half-life of fear when, through the trees ahead, she glimpsed a glint of metal. Luke saw it too, and redoubled his pace, hacking branches out of the way. Nora followed, hope flaring anew as they crashed into a small clearing. Towering before them was a nondescript metal structure, all straight lines and geometric shapes. It seemed utterly out of place in the organic chaos of the forest. A radio antenna spun lazily atop a domed roof, and Nora realized with a jolt that this must be the source of the mysterious broadcasts. She turned to Luke, mouth open to voice the realization, but froze at the wild light in his eyes. "They did this to us," he hissed, brandishing his hatchet. "They warped the forest. I'll make them pay." Before Nora could react, he charged at the building's heavy steel door and began hacking wildly. She grabbed at him, pleading, but he threw her off with inhuman strength. There was no reasoning with the madness that had overtaken him. The door dented under Luke's onslaught, just as shuffling footsteps sounded from the trees. Nora whirled to see a small horde of zombies emerging, drawn by the noise and commotion. With a sob, she left Luke to his frenzy and ran for the only shelter available. Inside the strange facility, the door buckled inward just as she threw her weight against it. Nora tumbled into a sterile white corridor and slammed the steel panel shut behind her, locking out the dead. Heavy thuds and Luke's enraged screams echoed from the other side as she sagged to the floor, drained in body and spirit. Slow clapping broke the silence. Nora looked up to see a tall, thin man regarding her from the end of the hall. His eyes were cold and calculating behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Well done surviving this long." "Well done surviving this long." Not many could withstand the rage and grief gave Nora strength to stand on trembling legs. "What have you done?" she rasped. "Why did you warp the forest? Make us lose years of our lives?" The man, Dr. Markov, she realized, merely smiled thinly. A necessary step in the grand design. Mankind had to be pruned back, so to speak, and the survivors had to be tested for strength of mind and spirit. Nora shook her head, refusing to accept his twisted logic. "Stop this now. Undo what you've done to the outside." Markov tilted his head, considering. "I'm afraid it's too late to stop the cataclysm. But you have shown promise. Join me, and together we can usher in a new era where only the fittest survive." He held out a hand. Nora stared at it, then back up at his cold, calculating eyes. With a snarl, she lunged forward and slammed her fist into his smug face. Markov reeled back with a grunt of pain and surprise. Seizing her chance, Nora turned and sprinted down the corridor, searching desperately for an exit. Alarms began to blare as she rounded a corner and spotted an emergency exit sign overhead. With a final burst of energy, she threw open the door and stumbled to a halt, staring in disbelief. Before her, the forest stretched as far as the eye could see, but it was wrong. Impossibly huge mushrooms and fungi towered among the trees, glowing with eerie bioluminescence. Strange vines writhed and curled as if alive. This was no longer the forest. She and Luke had entered what seemed like lifetimes ago. The cataclysm had transformed it into an alien wilderness, one that humanity could never hope to survive in. Tears streamed down Nora's face as the full horror of Markov's plan was revealed at last. He had engineered an apocalypse to wipe the slate clean, but the forces he had unleashed were beyond any human's control. As Markov's heavy footfalls approached behind her, Nora knew there was only one choice left. With a final, ragged sob, she stepped out into the glowing mushroom forest and vanished into the mists of the new, inhuman world.